Welcome everyone. Welcome to this special webinar in collaboration with Biocidin Botanicals and Fullscript/Emerson Ecologics. I'm Amy Regan from Fullscript, and I am so glad you joined us today. A few housekeeping notes. Please place all questions you have in the Q&A box for the question and answer session at the end of the presentation. This webinar is being recorded, and the recording will be sent via email to all attendees and registrants. And there's a copy of the presentation slides in the handouts section. Now, here is Dr. Sean Mask with today's presentation. Welcome.
Hi, Amy. Thank you for having us. We appreciate it. Thanks, everyone, for joining us today. I appreciate your time coming to learn a little bit about histamine and how we can support those experiencing histamine intolerance. I'm just going to try and make this bigger. There we go. So, a little bit about me. I'm the Assistant Director of Clinical Education for Biocidin Botanicals, and I support the Clinical Education Department, research, as well as product development. I am a naturopathic doctor. You can see I went to the Canadian College of Naturopathic Medicine, and I've been in and out of practice on and off for about 6 or 7 years, and have been fully on board with Biocidin for the last 1.5 years now. So our learning objectives for today, we're going to talk about histamine, what it is, how it's produced, and where it's found predominantly. We'll talk a little bit about histamine physiology. So what does it do in the body, or what are its primary roles? We'll talk about histamine metabolism, and then ultimately histamine intolerance, or those suffering from histamine-related symptomology. We'll look a little bit at dysbiosis, or microbial imbalance, and how that plays a role into those suffering with histamine intolerance symptoms. And then also the connection with Lipopolysaccharides, or LPS, a bacterial endotoxin. And then finally, we'll look at some independent research we've done talking about therapeutic interventions that can support overall microbial balance and GI function in order to support those experiencing histamine-related symptoms. So let's start off with some histamine basics. We know that histamine is a powerful biogenic amine, and it binds to a family of receptors on various target cells in various tissues and mediates its biological reactions. It's produced from the amino acid, the essential amino acid histidine, through decarboxylation in the Golgi apparatus by an enzyme known as histidine decarboxylase. And this will ultimately form histamine, which is then further stored in cytoplasmic granules before it's released in order to act on histamine receptors throughout the body. Histamine can be released or synthesized and released by a variety of cells, but most predominantly the primary cellular sources are going to be mast cells and basophils, but we can see some of our other cells there: chromaffin cells, platelets, dendritic cells, T cells, as well as histaminergic neurons in the central nervous system. Here's a little flow chart looking at the metabolism from the first amino acid histidine, again acting through that histamine decarboxylase. Oops, that got cut off a little there in my diagram, to produce histamine. Histamine is then further metabolized predominantly through the 2 enzymes you see listed below, DAO standing for diamine oxidase, HNMT standing for histamine N-methyltransferase, and that will ultimately contribute to the production of the downstream products imidazole acetaldehyde, or imidazole 4-acetate, along with N-methylhistamine. So these are the 4 receptors that histamine can act on: the H1, H2, H3, and H4 receptors. We can see that they have widespread distribution throughout the body with some overlap. And then when those receptors are activated, we can see, ooh, what happened to the slides there? I lost them. My apologies. There we go. Sorry about that. I'm not sure how that happened. Again, seeing the activity of histamine acting on those various histamine receptors, we can note a wide variety of effects. And then the final column, looking at some of the conventional pharmaceutical medications that can block these histamine receptors in order to exert their antihistamine effects. Now, looking at that in a little more graphical representation, on the left here, we can see, sorry, this slide came out a little fuzzy. It was good on my end. We can see runny nose, nasal obstruction, excess mucus congestion, some of our typical symptoms of allergic-like reactions we'll see there acting on those H1 receptors. But I'd like to bring your attention to the right diagram here and looking more specifically when we see histamine acting on the H1 receptors. We can see here in the top two pink circles some of the more typical allergic type of symptoms: vasodilation, bronchoconstriction, platelet aggregation, hypercoagulation, increased inflammation. These are all going to be representative with our typical allergy symptoms. If we move, and then we can see here in the blue box, these are some of the classical H1 receptor antagonists for their antihistamine effects. If we look down here at the H2 receptors, these are predominantly involved in gastric acid secretion, as well as increasing heart rate and cardiac output. And then again, we can see in the blue box some of the classical H2 receptor antagonists that are used to block that, like H2 blockers we know to reduce people who have acid reflux. If we look down here at the bottom pink circle or oval, we can see the H3 receptors are predominantly involved in the sleep-wake cycle, as well as involved in cognition and affect the mitochondria for regulation of energy production. Again, we can see some drugs down at the bottom that block the H3 receptors. There's not as many of those as the H1 and the H2 receptor antagonists. And then finally, if we look over here at the H4 receptors, we can see that those are involved in calcium release from the endoplasmic reticulum, as well as some other activities like immunomodulation. And there's currently drugs in development right now as H4 blockers, but none that have made it to market. Now, ultimately, too, if we look at these four blue boxes on the outsides of the diagram, all I want to draw your attention here, too, is that we do get expression of all the or overlap of these receptors on various cell types, and specifically pointing out that human mast cells, you'll see all four types of receptors found on those mast cells, and why we're typically talking about histamine as it relates to mast cells and the release from those mast cells. So again, recapping here that diagram on the right, just looking at some of the typical symptoms involved in excess histamine or its overall physiological function. But as it relates to what we're talking about here, pointing out its involvement in gut motor function, its ability to support permeability in the intestinal mucosa, it's involved in mucosal ion secretion and fluid transport, modulating inflammation. And then it's also involved in cell proliferation, differentiation, embryonic development. So a lot of important effects of histamine. Ultimately, balance is really key here. We need histamine for its physiological roles in everyday functioning. However, it's when it becomes imbalanced that we really see the problems associated with excess histamine. So in this review, looking at the gastric parietal cell, pointing out that the parietal cells are responsible for gastric acid secretion. And so obviously, as I noted, one of the drugs, an H2 blocker that many of us will be familiar with, involved in people who have excess acid secretion or acid reflux. Typically, those drugs are given in order to reduce gastric acid output so that it resolves some of that symptomology. But pointing out here that parietal cell secretion of that gastric acid is very much regulated through a number of mechanisms. But one of those mechanisms happens to be histamine, which is why they use those H2 blockers in order to reduce gastric acid secretion. Now, we're obviously talking here about histamine intolerance or histamine-related symptoms, but I want to point out that histamine intolerance needs to be distinguished from histamine poisoning. Histamine poisoning is also known as scromboid syndrome or scromboidosis. And while we might not hear about it as much over here in the United States, it does happen throughout the world. The word for this actually originated from the family of fish that was associated with this type of food poisoning. That family of fish is called the Scrombidae family. And it's actually considered to be one of the most common poisonings throughout the world caused by eating fish. Now, the manifestations of this poisoning could include skin rash, severe abdominal pain, vomiting, diarrhea, shortness of breath. So some of those, obviously the relationship to excess histamine in the body, but it could also be fatal. And so fatal fish poisonings are typically being driven by this histamine poisoning. Now, we can see here histamine intolerance is ultimately contributed to by a number of factors, and diagnosing those with histamine intolerance usually is associated with those who are consuming foods that are high in histamine, but often accompanied by insufficient levels or deficient levels of our enzyme diamine oxidase. Now, we can see that there could be genetic polymorphisms in either of the major enzymes that break down histamine, including diamine oxidase and histamine N-methyltransferase. There could be diseases that are associated with a deficiency of those two enzymes. We know that a number of pharmaceutical drugs can inhibit the activity of the diamine oxidase enzyme. And then ultimately contributing are foods that are rich in histamine. A lot of these include fermented foods or aged foods. So that could be sauerkraut, kimchi, it could be aged fish or smoked meat products, and various cheeses are known to be high in histamine. Then we have foods that can actually inhibit the activity of diamine oxidase. So this again could be fermented meats, fermented cheeses, fish sauces, and then notable in our produce, green peppers, citrus, wheat germ, and bean sprouts have all been shown to interfere with diamine oxidase. And then furthermore, we have foods that promote histamine release from our own cells. So this could include foods like papaya, strawberries, again, citrus fruits, certain nuts, egg whites, chocolate, and then again, aged fish and meat products as well. And then last but not least, as it especially relates to our topic today, is dysbiosis or microbial imbalance. And we'll get into a little bit more of that. So looking at a differential diagnosis for histamine intolerance, we have to rule out food allergies or other food intolerances like lactose or fructose intolerance. We need to rule out irritable bowel syndrome or SIBO, ruling out celiac disease, H. pylori infection, eosinophilic gastroenteritis, other drivers of just urticaria or hives and rashes, and then systemic mastocytosis would all be included. Let's talk a little bit further about diamine oxidase. So this is an extracellular enzyme. It'll oxidize and deaminate histamine into imidazole acetaldehyde, and it's our primary enzyme that's responsible for keeping our histamine levels in check. It's predominantly produced in the microvilli of the small intestine, and so we can understand that anything that damages the microvilli ultimately may cause or contribute to insufficient levels of this enzyme and make it more likely that someone will experience histamine intolerance type symptoms. So I just said the atrophy of the microvilli. We can think of something like gluten sensitivity or full-blown celiac disease, where we see atrophy of those microvilli will be associated with low diamine enzyme oxidase levels. And this is often low plasma diamine oxidase levels is used to aid in the diagnosis of histamine intolerance, as we noted earlier. We do know that people with low DAO levels seem to react to everything. And these patients will often improve when they're put on prescribed antihistamine or an over-the-counter antihistamine, or when they respond positively to a low histamine diet. So we talked about this earlier briefly. So things that modulate diamine oxidase levels, this could be high histamine foods where they're consumed in excess and it overwhelms the activity of the diamine oxidase enzyme such that the circulating pool of histamine will remain high and drive those histamine-related symptoms. Again, we can see there the aged cheeses and fish are two major foods. Then we have things like alcohol, over-the-counter medications, and prescribed medications that can block the activity of the diamine oxidase enzyme. We know that antihistamines, they become a bit of a catch-22 in that certain antihistamines, like the H2 blockers, can lower gastric acid secretion. That lower level of gastric acid could ultimately contribute to the development of dysbiosis, and that dysbiosis then can drive problems with the diamine oxidase enzyme or with the ability to break down histamine otherwise. We know that host health So that could be nutrient deficiencies or insufficiencies. We had Tom Malter on our series of webinars last year, and he did a great discussion on the topic of genetics as it relates to histamine intolerance. So if you've got an account with us, it'd be great to go back and check out that webinar. But also we can see pregnancy can affect the ability of the diamine oxidase levels, as well as systemic or chronic inflammation can really interfere with its activity. Finally, as I just noted in Tom Malter's topic, the genetic polymorphisms, especially in the AOC1 gene, and that's the gene that produces diamine oxidase. And then finally, and importantly, the microbiome can really impact diamine oxidase function. So we know that certain microbial species can produce histamine, and that can ultimately contribute to the total histamine load in the body and drive some of these histamine-related symptoms or histamine intolerance in our patients. So this was a great paper looking at microbial patterns in those who are experiencing histamine intolerance. And we can see here that besides the degradation of orally supplied histamine due to a diamine oxidase deficiency, deranged gut flora may also contribute to an elevated histamine pool. So we know that the microbiome can be an endogenous source of histamine production. Research has found that those with histamine intolerance tend to have lower diversity overall in their microbiomes relative to a healthy population. We know that controls or healthy individuals not experiencing histamine-related symptoms had higher levels of bifidobacterium, and that those experiencing histamine intolerance tend to have higher levels of proteobacterium. We have to be careful with those who may be experiencing histamine intolerance and who are already taking probiotics. A lot of commercial or readily available probiotic blends may have members, some of them listed here, that are known histamine producers. And so while they think they're doing themselves a service by taking a probiotic, they may actually be aggravating their histamine intolerance symptoms by contributing to an elevation of the total histamine pool. This is another paper, again, looking at intestinal dysbiosis in patients with histamine intolerance. We can see here that in comparison to healthy individuals, those with histamine intolerance tended to have significantly lower proportions of the family's Prevoteliaceae, Ruminococcus, Faecalibacterium, especially Faecalibacterium prausnitzii, one of our keystone members of the microbiome and a well-known short-chain fatty acid butyrate producer. Obviously, butyrate extremely important for the health of our gastrointestinal cells. It provides food or an energy source for the colonocytes, but well known to be involved in inflammatory balance and having systemic effects as well. We also see that those with histamine intolerance had a higher abundance of histamine-secreting bacteria, including genera Staphylococcus and Proteus, as well as Clostridium perfringens, Enterococcus faecalis, Morganella, Staphylococcus species, and Photobacterium as well. We know from another study in 2017 that some of these pathogens like Enterococcus faecalis, Proteus mirabilis, and E. coli are well-known producers of histamines as well as other biogenic amines such as putrescine, cadaverine, and even tyramine. And ultimately, those other biogenic amines like putrescine and cadaverine, if those are increased in numbers, those can interfere with diamine oxidase activity as well because it acts on those amines as well, and that can ultimately lead to increases in histamine pool. Now, this discussion obviously needs to include lipopolysaccharides if we're discussing dysbiosis. Most of you will be well familiar with what lipopolysaccharide is, but they're ultimately large molecules consisting of a lipid and a polysaccharide that are known to be bacterial endotoxins. Now, we know that LPS is a major component of the outer membrane of gram-negative bacteria, and it contributes greatly to the structural integrity of those bacteria and supports or acts as a protection, protecting the membrane from certain kinds of chemical attack. Now, LPS is known to be the most abundant antigen on the cell surface of certain gram-negative bacteria like E. coli and Salmonella, ultimately contributing up to 80% of that outer membrane. We know that our LPS is often synonymous with the term endotoxin, as it acts as an endotoxin, and it's known to be one of the most powerful stimulants of inflammation throughout the body, so much so that they use it in experimental animal models to induce widespread inflammation in order to test various drugs. So what's the connection to histamine? Well, we know from published research that lipopolysaccharides can upregulate the activity of the histidine decarboxylase enzyme. So that's the enzyme, again, that converts histidine into histamine. So ultimately, that'll upregulate the production of histamine. We know that LPS increases the histamine pool 4 to 15-fold, depending on the tissue being investigated. Basophils, which if you recall, basophils and mast cells are the two primary producers or synthesizers of histamine. Those basophils show a 6-fold increase in histamine levels with LPS exposure. We also know that LPS enhances the H1 receptor function in endothelial cells and can really drive an inflammatory response in those endothelial cells. We know that LPS will cause systemic mast cell degranulation, and that'll ultimately contribute to those allergic type symptoms, including asthma. We know that LPS-mediated mast cell activation will activate natural killer cells as well as interferon gamma secretion. And finally, stabilization of our brain mast cells alleviates an LPS-induced neuroinflammation by inhibiting microglial activation. So we understand, obviously, if we're talking about dysbiosis and its contribution to histamine, we know that we need to modify our microbial balance throughout the body in order to reduce some of these histamine-related symptoms. So we believe that microbes matter most. We know we're host to trillions of microorganisms, like we're a big moving spaceship for these bacteria and other microorganisms. And it's really been in the last few decades that we've started to understand the magnitude of how these microorganisms support whole body health and really regulate our physiological functioning. If you look on PubMed, you'll see well over 100,000 publications that are focused on the microbiomes and how they relate to host physiology, but they play a vital role. They foster our immune competence and immune tolerance so that we don't react to everything we take into our bodies. They protect us against invaders. They support tissue healing. They can synthesize nutrients that help optimize our own nutrient levels. So in short, we really need them to function optimally. And by beautiful design, we are inoculated with these microorganisms from birth, fortified in infancy if we're breastfed, and then we're exposed to them on a daily basis such that they become an essential part of who we are. Let's move on to looking at some of our independent research as it relates to histamine. So we'll look at 3 participants here. This is from an ongoing case series where we're really looking at, can we affect the function of the GI tract and support those who may have issues with histamine. So what we're looking at here is a baseline testing, the pre-test. This is an advanced intestinal barrier assessment available by a lab some of you may be familiar with. And what we did here for an intervention is we used a botanical formula that had a variety of botanicals and essential oils. We also used a binder or a binding agent such that we were optimizing elimination through using that botanical formula. And then looking at how are we impacting intestinal barrier function, as well as looking at what we'll see in the next slide is antibodies towards lipopolysaccharide. So we can see here at baseline, this patient had pretty good levels of zonulin, so not indicating a significant damage or leaky gut. However, we'll note that they had abnormally low levels of the enzyme diamine oxidase, and as a result, we can see that their plasma histamine was quite elevated into the abnormally high category. Now, if we look at this was about 5 to 6 weeks after the inclusion of the botanical formula and the binding agent. Not much change in their zonulin. It went down a tiny bit, but that wasn't elevated, so no worry there. However, we see that their diamine diamine oxidase levels significantly improved, coming up almost 4 times. And as a result of that, we see a significant drop in their plasma histamine levels. And ultimately, this patient experienced an improvement in their symptomology. Now, if we move to look at their antibodies towards LPS, we can see that at baseline, that same baseline testing period, they had significantly elevated levels of IgA antibodies towards LPS. So that's that mucosal antibody, or our first line of immune defense. We can see that they had borderline high levels of their IgG antibodies to LPS, and they had quite low levels to begin of IgM antibodies to LPS. And again, through a 5.5 week period of that botanical formula and binder, we see a significant drop in their IgA antibodies, actually down into the abnormally low category. We see an improvement into the normal range of their IgG antibodies, and then an improvement into the normal range coming up from their low levels, their IgM antibodies to LPS. Now here's participant number 2. Again, at baseline testing, we're seeing their zonulin levels are normal. However, again, we've got a low level of their diamine oxidase, but this patient hadn't been significantly affected in terms of their plasma histamine. It wasn't that elevated. So this could have been a developing problem for this person, where eventually their plasma histamine would have risen into the abnormally high category. Now, we had this middle test period. We can see something must have happened during this time. Not sure if maybe they ate a food that they were sensitive to or intolerant to, but we can actually see at this 6-week time point, their zonulin levels actually jumped up almost into the abnormally high category. However, their diamine oxidase levels had improved at this point, but interestingly enough, again, we're seeing a spike in their histamine levels. So maybe this was a case where the person actually was consuming a food that was really high in histamine, ultimately contributing to an elevation of that plasma histamine, and maybe contributing to some damage of the intestinal barrier and causing that zonulin level to spike. Now, continuing through this patient at the 12-week mark, roughly the 12-week mark here, we can see their zonulin levels coming back down to the normal range through the use of this botanical formula and binder, a continued improvement of their diamine oxidase levels, and then ultimately seeing a shift back into the normal range of their plasma histamine. Again, this same patient, looking at their LPS antibodies, we didn't have the 12-week mark for this test, but we do have the 6-week mark. Again, at baseline, we're seeing an abnormally high or borderline high level of IgA antibodies, an abnormally low level of IgG and IgM antibodies. And again, at the 6-week mark of that botanical formula and binder, we're seeing an improvement into the normal range of their IgA. We're seeing an upregulation of their IgG antibodies, still low, but definitely moving in the right direction, and a slight improvement in their IgM antibodies. And I'm sure if we had the 12-week mark test for this as well, we would have seen a continued improvement in these antibodies. Now, the last patient we'll look at here, again, their baseline normal zonulin levels, but a low level of diamine oxidase, a borderline high level of histamine. And again, here, this was roughly a 3-month mark test of this using the botanical formula and the binder. Again, not much change, slight drop in their zonulin levels, but not elevated to begin with. Significant improvement, almost doubling their diamine oxidase levels. And as a result of that, a significant drop in their histamine levels back into the normal range. So definitely getting improvement in gastrointestinal function there that supports improvement in those diamine oxidase levels and a drop in the histamine pool. Again, the last patient here, looking at their antibodies to LPS or lipopolysaccharides, baseline had borderline high IgA antibodies. We can see the IgG antibodies were actually off the chart here. It stops at 50. They're at almost a 75. And then a significantly high level of IgM antibodies. Again, 3 months on the protocol of the Botanical formula and binder, we see the IgA dropping back down into the normal category. We see the IgG actually dropping into the abnormally low category from that really high elevation. And then again, an improvement back down into the normal range of the IgG antibody, or IgM antibodies, sorry. So definitely seeing both immune modulation, improvements likely in the dysbiosis. That was probably evident, obviously seeing these high levels of lipopolysaccharide antibodies in each of these patients. They probably had a degree of intestinal permeability and some state of dysbiosis contributing to elevations of the LPS. But through the use of that Botanical formula and the binder, we're seeing improvements in intestinal barrier function, in the ability to improve diamine oxidase levels and drop those plasma histamine levels, and then a shift in our immune function and response to LPS. Now, obviously, there's concern if we're using a formula of herbs that may be addressing pathogenic or non-commensal or opportunistic microorganisms in the gut. Are we harming some of our commensal microorganisms? And so this was a small pilot study that was conducted. We can see 13 participants, again, using that Botanical formulation and the binding agent for a period of 8 weeks at maximum dosing. And what we found in these patients, ultimately, all we were concerned with was, are we causing detriment to the overall probiotic abundance or commensal microorganisms? Because we obviously don't want to harm those as we're trying to reduce some of those potential non-commensal or pathogenic microorganisms. And what we actually found was a bit of a surprise to us. We found that 9 of those 13 participants actually showed an increase in total probiotic abundance. And specifically, we saw in 8 of 11 of those patients increases in Akkermansia muciniphila. This is, again, one of our keystone species of the microbiome, well known to be associated with bacterial richness and abundance, and has been associated with improvements in metabolic markers like lipid balance and glucose balance throughout the body. So there's each of those participants. Sorry, that's coming up a little blurry. But what I could point out here is that if you look at the total abundance in the bottom, each color-coded is an individual in the study, and their before and after testing of these beneficial microorganisms. And so all but 4 of them saw increases in their total probiotic abundance. And the ones that did see a decrease is actually so minor and definitely not significant. So we obviously can't talk about dysbiosis and microbes throughout the body without considering the topic of biofilms. I'm sure all of you are well familiar with biofilms, what they are, but for those who may not be, biofilms are ultimately communities of microorganisms that come together and start to secrete what's known as an extracellular matrix. It could be made up of proteins, glycoproteins, lipoproteins, but it ultimately creates a mesh-like network around them that almost acts like a house for the microorganisms, or a little cloaking shield, if you want, that ultimately allows protection and allows them to create environmental niches within that biofilm in order to survive and thrive and increase their numbers. Now, one of the big problems with these biofilms, and I'd like to point out, not all biofilms are bad. Some of our commensal or beneficial species like to hang out in biofilms as well. But for the pathogenic or opportunistic pathogens that like to hang out in these, in addition to being protected in there, these biofilms ultimately create a sticky environment that things can get trapped within those biofilms. This can include histamine, whether that's coming in through food or being produced through our own cells. This could include things like exogenous toxins, heavy metals, pesticides, PCBs. It can include microbial irritants themselves produced from the microbes within those biofilms, and that could be their toxins as well. So those lipopolysaccharides, oxalates from our food could get bound in there as well. And this is really important as we're trying to address these biofilms. We need to remember that as those break down, any number of these constituents or metabolic debris that may be contained within there can be released and ultimately cause discomfort or aggravate a person by driving an immune response and contributing to an inflammatory reaction. So really important then when we're addressing these through various botanicals or other supplements that we really want to emphasize the use of a binding agent so that it grabs onto some of these materials, this metabolic debris released from the biofilms, and makes it easier on the patient to optimize their digestion and elimination. Now, again, if we're talking about dysbiosis in the GI tract as it relates to histamine, we also want to consider dysbiosis in the oral cavity. It's well known that oral dysbiosis or oral pathogens are highly related to a vast array of systemic illnesses. And this is ultimately because of the close proximity of these bacteria in the mouth to the systemic circulation. I'm just going to jump to this slide. If we look forward and we're looking here at the tooth and the periodontal space or periodontal pocket between the tooth and the gingival tissues, we can see that as bacteria accumulate and become dysbiotic, they start to create inflammation in those gingival tissues. And as those gingival tissue barriers start to disintegrate, we can now get movement of both bacteria as well as their toxins or metabolites into the systemic circulation that is occurring in those gingival tissues. And now those pathogens have access to the systemic circulation to move throughout the body. We know that oral pathogens have been associated with atherosclerotic disease, with Alzheimer's disease, with non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, and a wide range of other systemic illnesses. So it's really important to address oral dysbiosis as well. We can see here in this paper that lipopolysaccharides are known to stimulate the histamine-forming enzyme histidine decarboxylase activity in the dental pulp and gingiva of a mouse model. And so ultimately, if we've got dysbiosis in the oral cavity and some of those dysbiotic organisms are producing LPS in their cell membranes, that can ultimately drive the increases in histidine decarboxylase, increasing histamine levels and ultimately contributing to those who may be experiencing histamine intolerance. So again, we talked about our botanical formulation in association with the independent research we did. We really believe in our company of the power of botanicals. Obviously, it's in our name, Biocide and Botanicals. We understand that microbes are not an enemy to simply be eliminated, but it's an ecology to be nourished, just like we need to support the ecology of our environment on planet Earth. And we can do that by working with the gift of botanicals. We know that plants have been around for far longer than we have on this planet, and they've learned to grow and flourish under the same environmental stressors that we have. They've co-evolved with these microorganisms in the soil and in the environment for far longer and have developed constituents or molecular compounds that can inhibit the growth of some of these organisms as well as nourish the growth of some of these organisms. So they have a real selectivity in order to affect various microorganisms that inhabit our bodies. We know that plants are made up of hundreds, if not thousands, of molecular components, and each one of these has its own mechanism of action to affect human physiology. And when we layer botanicals together in a formula, we get a great synergy that occurs between all these chemical constituents, and where we see that the outcome of a layered formula, botanical formulation, is not simply additive, but is exponential in its ability to affect and modulate human functioning. So we emphasize that botanicals have a graceful and mighty solution that cannot be duplicated. They allow us the power to achieve and maintain balance and truly the power to thrive. And so we would really like to consider using botanicals whenever you have patients who may be experiencing histamine intolerance in order to optimize the microbial balance in the body and especially the gastrointestinal tract. That will improve gastrointestinal functioning as a whole, ultimately allow the body to do what it does and produce its adequate levels of diamine oxidase levels in order to break down histamine and support those who experience that symptomology. So I'd like to thank you for your time today. Thanks for joining us, and hope you learned a little bit about histamine and what things to consider when we're trying to support those with histamine-related symptoms or histamine intolerance. So we'll open it up now for some questioning.
Yes, thank you so much for that presentation, Dr. Mansk. Amazing. We have many, many questions, and I would like to welcome Erica Stowe-Madison, who is the clinical consultant at Biocidin, to help out and tackle these questions.
Thank you so much, Amy, and excellent job, Dr. Mansky. That was so informative. Yes, we do have quite a few questions that came in, so I'm just going to try to parse through some of them here. Let's start with Larissa's question. Larissa. Why mast cell disorder is separate from histamine intolerance? I thought these two exist in parallel. Could you please explain?
They do. That, there's often a relationship. We have to remember mast cells can have hundreds of preformed mediators within them, not just histamine. And so while histamine can play a major role in mast cell dysfunction or mast cell syndrome, we have to remember that these other preformed mediators play a vital role as well, and that we can't just relate it to one compound. And so while there's definitely major overlap between them, there's a lot of other factors that could go into a mast cell disorder.
That makes sense. Yeah. Okay. So this is a little bit different, but this is from Lindsay. It is, which over-the-counter drugs and prescription meds are most common in lowering or blocking that diamine oxidase enzyme, which I know you touched on in the presentation, but.
Ooh, yeah. There's a lot. So pretty well-known ones, aspirin, can interfere with it. We already mentioned alcohol, although it's technically not a drug the way we consider it. Birth control pills have been known to interfere with it. Obviously, H2 blockers can contribute to it. In terms of, I don't have the list in front of me, but there's a lot of we said a lot of prescription medications. You can find this in Google as a quick search. Some of the major ones. There's some really good articles on PubMed that go through a lot of the medications that will interfere with diamine oxidase. But yeah, sorry, I don't have the full list in front of me.
Well, that was really helpful. And kind of on that note of knowing that if someone's on H1 or H2 blockers, and that's going to inhibit diamine oxidase, are they expected to be on those H1 and H2 blockers for a lifetime if they have histamine issues? And should they try to wean off once things do start to calm down?
Yeah, ultimately, I mean, many of these medications, in terms of histamine, they're not meant to be taken lifelong. Ultimately, we want to try and support the body to function more optimally. And as we said in this presentation, we really want to consider addressing dysbiosis. We all know how important gastrointestinal wellness and microbial balance is. However, it's, thinking about what nutrient deficiencies may you have. Do you need to look into your genetics and find that maybe you have single nucleotide polymorphisms that are contributing to this, that makes it more problematic to you? But the goal would be to not take them long term. Most of those medications are not studied to be taken for lifetimes, right? They're maybe the longest you might see a study is going for, 5-10 years, maybe, but they're really not meant to be taken that long. Same thing with someone with acid reflux on an H2 blocker. The goal isn't to keep you on that for life, or it shouldn't be. It should be what can we look at in the meantime while we support your symptoms to figure out what is really driving the cause of the symptoms for you, and how can we get you back to healthy function so that you don't have to rely on these medications.
Yeah, I love that. Taking the whole body approach. What's the source of the problem instead of staying on a Band-Aid for the rest of your life? And that question comes from Alexis Manning. So thanks, Alexis, for that question. Okay, let me go back. So this question comes from Nikki Gepner. What have you noticed with using a binding agent versus not? So kind of going back to our botanical formulas and using those for the histamine issues. Yep.
Yep. So it tends to come up, and I guess, we always have practitioners say, do you have to use a binding agent if you're using something that's addressing microbial imbalance? The answer is no, not in reality, but we're just trying to optimize the elimination. As I said, when we're addressing those microbes as they break down or those biofilms break down and they release some of those microbial metabolites or potential toxins that have been stored in the biofilms or the endotoxins in the cell walls of bacteria, those are going to stress the immune system and potentially make a patient feel worse while you're trying to get them to feel better. And, we know that as a Herxheimer reaction or a die-off reaction. And so we're really trying to make it easier for the patient so that they don't experience that Herx reaction. It doesn't mean everyone will experience a Herx reaction and hence maybe not needing the use of a binding agent. But we could also consider that everyone is exposed to toxins in their everyday environment. I would assume the majority of us are not eating 100% every morsel of food being organic, even if it's not the food we're considering. We've got toxins in our air. We've got toxins in our home, from our furniture, from our clothes, from the things we build our houses with. All of these things are adding to our toxic burden, and the use of a binder can help support the elimination of some of those just on a daily basis. And so if you consider adding that in while you're trying to reduce some of that microbial load on the body, it's just going to make it easier on a patient for their cells to not be so burdened, not be so bogged down by oxidative and inflammatory stress, and ultimately allow their body to function more efficiently.
Beautiful. And since we're kind of going over binders and products, I know this question came up quite a bit. What were the products that were used in those lab tests that you showed in the PowerPoint presentation?
Yep. So I don't know if I'm allowed to actually say the products themselves, but I can tell you some of the ingredients that are in them, at least from the binding agent perspective. There's zeolite clay, activated charcoal, humic acid. There's a very specific form of silica known as MMST silica, along with some aquapectin and aloe vera. When we're talking about addressing microbial imbalance in the body, there is a plethora of botanicals we could choose from, hundreds, too many to mention, but some of the top ones would be bilberry, the various species of echinacea, oregano, golden seal. You can look at the essential oils of oregano, of galbanum, of fumitory, tea tree oil. So many botanicals that we could choose from. Obviously, we've got a very specific formulation that we use for our independent research that's been clinically effective for so many people and so many practitioners. But you've got, as I said, hundreds of botanicals you could choose from and put together that really help to optimize microbial balance throughout the body.
Excellent. And so going back to those lab tests, a lot of folks just are curious, how do you test for histamine intolerance? How do you test for low DAO levels?
Yep. So that's that test, that advanced intestinal and barrier assessment is through Precision Point Diagnostics. They were formerly known as Dunwoody Labs. That's primarily who we utilize for our research. I'm sure there are other labs that offer that type of testing as well. But, is it a definitive that you have it? No, but it's a good guidepost to tell you, look, your diamine oxidase levels are low. We're seeing higher than normal histamine levels in your plasma. And so it's, if you're already experiencing symptoms of histamine intolerance or what seems like an aggravated an allergic response, there's probably a degree of overactivity of histamine. And so again, it can act as a guidepost to kind of confirm your diagnosis of histamine intolerance.
Excellent. Okay. A lot of people still asking questions about specific herbs and specific products, of course, and timing of binders. That's a question that's come up a little bit. How do you time binders in a support program for this kind of condition, histamine intolerance?
So we ultimately like to encourage people to take them away from food and supplementation, but most importantly, away from medications, prescribed medications or over-the-counter medications. Well, there's not 100% certainty that you're going to interfere with the absorption, there's an increased likelihood. And so we want to make sure that we're not interfering with someone's medication dosage that's meant to hit a specific target level in the body. But importantly as well, we don't want to impair nutrient absorption or supplemental absorption. And so just trying to take them at least a couple hours away from any of those. We typically recommend practitioners tell their patients to take them at bedtime, as long as they're not taking any medications and supplements at bedtime. That will, minimize any interference with the absorption of anything and allow it to be effective. For those that do take a medication at bedtime, it's just trying to find a time in their day. The other interesting thing about a binding agent that can be useful for those experiencing bloating and gas. And so you might get a trade-off if you have them take it after a meal where they're very bloated because maybe they've eaten too fast or chosen to eat a food they're intolerant to. And so you're just getting the trade-off of maybe interfering with nutrient absorption at the benefit of trying to reduce their gas and bloating and make it a little easier for them to continue through their day.
Oh, that's wonderful. Yeah, it has many benefits, and I think in this situation, having a binder. Yep. Another very popular question, and I don't know if you can speak to the specifics here, but are there good probiotics specifically for those that do have histamine intolerance?
Yep. So I'd probably be recommending more spore-based probiotics initially. Those spore-based probiotics don't tend to be affected by botanicals that may otherwise harm pathogenic or opportunistic or non-commensal microorganisms. And two, they don't tend to be the ones that are associated with elevations of histamine. So that's always good. There are definitely probiotic, conventional or commercial probiotic strains in both the Lactobacillus and Bifido families that aren't known histamine producers. They're generally neutral. And so those are great to use. You just have to look up some of those and look for formulations. Another option would be Saccharomyces boulardii. That's obviously a probiotic yeast not known to contribute to the histamine load. At least that I'm aware of. And so you've got a number of options, but I guess importantly is just trying to make sure that they avoid, if you are experiencing histamine intolerance, avoiding those species that are known to increase histamine production.
Yeah, absolutely. I did a little bit of a search too, and it looked like lactobacillus, like you're saying, certain lactobacillus rhamnosus and
Yep.
reuteri might be really beneficial at downregulating biogenic amines. Yep. So another very popular question, of course, is can folks take a DAO supplement? I don't know if you know too much about that, but just curious.
Yep, absolutely. So, again, if you're trying to figure out some of the contributing factors that are driving your histamine-related symptoms, or you've been diagnosed with histamine intolerance, you can definitely take supplemental diamine oxidase levels to help break down excess histamine. That can be really great if you want to eat a food that's known to be high in histamine, just making sure that you're reducing its or that you're improving its metabolism. If you happen to be low and you know that by testing, or maybe you just assume you're low because you are experiencing histamine intolerance symptoms, it's important. But even anybody in general, even someone who might have healthy levels, if you're about to sit down and have, charcuterie and maybe some sauerkraut, kimchi, and maybe you're going to have a glass of alcohol as well, just taking some extra diamine oxidase level can just help support you and maybe not contribute to the symptoms. You might not be full-blown histamine intolerant, but maybe you feel a little crappy after you eat all that food. And it could be simply that you aren't breaking down enough of the histamine in those foods.
Yeah, that's great. And I know you and I have kind of chatted a little bit briefly about like the fact that sprouts, right, can contain DAO, and you can use sprouts as another way to increase DAO levels, especially if they're grown in the dark.
Yeah. So really interesting. Yeah, I think what we're looking at, broccoli sprouts are really well known. And so you have to eat a lot of them if you really want to get an adequate level, but amazing way that you can use nature to support the health of your body without having to rely on a supplement per se.
Yeah, I love that. Okay. Another question here. This is from Rita Wilhelm. Does MTHFR cause an HNMT deficiency and thus increase the demand for diamine oxidase?
Ooh, I'm not as up to date on my genetics understanding. I would refer back Tom Malter, whether it's through our webinar or another webinar he's done for another company. Watch one of his. He does a really great explanation of all the interactions between the enzymes, the sulfation enzymes, the MTHFR, and how they all relate to the HNMT enzyme and any SNPs that may be there. And then again, the nutrients that'll support that. So sorry, I can't answer that in more detail.
No, that was helpful. This is from Jesse Sinurid. Sorry, Jesse, if I butchered that. Have you found alcohol in botanical tinctures as a problem or a source for increasing histamine levels?
I have not in patients that I've dealt with who have histamine intolerance. However, I guess theoretically you could say yes. You have to remember it's a really small amount that you're getting per serving of alcohol. In fact, in one serving, one teaspoon or 20 or 30 drops, it's probably a half teaspoon of a botanical tincture. You'd get the same amount in an overripe banana. It's really interesting. We did a dive into this a couple of years ago at looking at alcohol production in foods. We actually get a pretty decent little quantity just from the foods we consume on a daily basis, such that it would probably equate to the amount you'd get in a serving of a tincture. And probably not going to contribute all that much. It's more when you're consuming like a full serving of alcohol, like a glass of beer, a glass of wine, a mixed drink, and then potentially you're consuming multiples of those. That's where you'll really start to see that impairment. One, on just the gastrointestinal lining, it can contribute to inflammation. It can cause or create shifts in the microbiome, and then ultimately can interfere with that diamine oxidase enzyme.
Nice. Yeah. This question comes from Conchetta Butera. Does fish include all fish, mainly seafood, in regards to an increase in histamine reactions?
Could be. What they see it more is in aged fish. So you might think of like smoked herring or something like that, or dried fish. It can be a source as well. Fish that's canned can be a big source of it, because it can sit in the can and ultimately rise. I guess one thing we didn't point out in the list of foods is leftovers. Leftovers tend to increase histamine content. And so people with histamine intolerance really should try and stay away from leftovers. If you eat it maybe the next morning after you've had it the night before, that might not be too bad. But the longer it sits in the fridge, the higher that histamine level will go up, and then you'll likely drive your histamine-related symptoms.
Okay, kind of shifting gears a little bit here, kind of going into that histamine-brain connection. This is from Sarah Fawn. Any pearls for migraine sufferers with histamine contributing to the symptoms? Again,
I'd look to the GI tract and dysbiosis being major contributors. You have to look at the fact that it could be the histamine, it could be dysbiosis driving alterations in various neurotransmitters, and then affecting the vagus nerve, and that could potentially be contributing. You could potentially be at risk of increased pain sensitization when you have dysbiosis, and that obviously can contribute to the experience of a headache. But yeah, again, you're looking at, well, are you eating foods that are high in histamine? If not, do you have potentially low diamine oxidase levels? Do you have nutrient insufficiencies that are contributing to your ability to metabolize histamine in the body, ultimately, driving a more histamine type of migraine? It'd be hard to tease out all the things that may contribute, but yeah, I definitely look to gastrointestinal function and potential dysbiosis first and foremost.
Excellent. And same realm, this is from Olga Klein. How histamine affects, does histamine affect dopamine levels? Is there a connection there? So kind of in that same realm.
I'm not sure. I would I would say I can't comment on that. I've never looked into that connection. It wouldn't surprise me if there was, but I can't answer that sufficiently.
Got it. Yeah. And like you were saying, though, if there's dysbiosis and yeah, the neurotransmitters would be impacted. So yeah.
Yep.
Okay, well, I think we've kind of moved through most of the questions here. Just trying to see if I've missed anything that folks really need to know, but I think we've got most of them.
Okay. Well, thank you for those. I appreciate it. Thanks, Erica, for asking and relaying those questions.
Thank you.
We're turning it back over to Amy now.
Yes, thank you both so much. Lovely to see so many questions come through, lots of engagement on this, and lots of learnings too. So I really appreciate it. I just want to say thank you so much to everyone who attended today. And also thank you so much to Dr. Mensky and Erica who helped out and making this a great presentation. So everyone keep an eye out on their email. We will be sending the recording that way. And anybody who has any questions that they think of later, feel free to email me. My email address is just my full name. It's amy.regan@fullscript.com, and I can help out and get those questions answered. So I hope everybody enjoyed this presentation, and just any final thoughts, either Dr. Mensky or Erica, just kind of wrapping us up here.
Yeah, I think a lot of us experience some symptoms of histamine-related symptoms frequently. We might get an occasional what seems like an allergy response out in our environment, or maybe we've eaten a meal that we know has some foods that might not be the best, or maybe we don't even know that, but we feel a little crappy after a certain meal. And it might be important to remember that it could be a relationship to histamine, and it could be a direct indicator that you might have some GI dysfunction or some GI dysbiosis. And always important to remember, we always love to say the quote that all disease begins in the gut. And I think we all are readily aware that it is a foundational part of our health. And the fact that we've got this community of microorganisms down there, that so many things can cause imbalance there. And we might think we eat a healthy diet and we live a healthy, active lifestyle, but we're not really considering all the insults that can happen on a day-to-day basis, on an hour-to-hour basis in that microbiome. And that it's important to remember that we do everything we can to really nourish and support our microbiome and our GI function, and hopefully minimize the likelihood that we have histamine-related symptoms.
Excellent. Thanks so much to everyone again, and enjoy your afternoon.
Thanks, everyone. Have a good day.